So we're going to attempt to work our way through the rest of the ecology notes, both about populations and ecosystems and landscapes. And I'm going to try to streamline these as much as possible since we're not in person and it's not as easy for you to ask me questions. So um, uh, we'll kind of move through some things quickly and I'll highlight what things I think are most important and we'll kind of go from there. Now, we mentioned back before the three Ds of population dynamics, density, dispersion, and demographics. And so in this video, we're going to look at density and dispersion, but most of our focus is going to be here on density, which you do have to know quite a bit more about than you may have in a previous biology class. Then we'll touch quickly on dispersion, and then we'll have some other information about demographics at the end here as well. So density we started to talk about previously also. Density just meaning how many organisms are in a given place at a given time, essentially. And we talk about two different methods here. Plot sampling is what we had mentioned previously in class, which again, this will work if you have an immobile species in a given area. You can break up your area into a grid, essentially take a few samples from that grid, average those, and apply it to the whole, right? Now, mark recapture method is what we can use if we have a mobile species. Now that means that it's going to move around, right? So something like plot sampling doesn't work because a mobile species like, say, honeybees could just follow you around if we try to use a plot sampling method like this, right? In which case we never really end up figuring out how many are there total. So mark recapture includes tagging, right? We tag a group of organisms in a population, then we recollect organisms later, and we try to, you know, put that into the whole. It's really just a sort of a fractional analysis, I guess, so to speak, that we try to use to estimate an entire population size. So this is pretty straightforward. Also, there are like technical formulas you can use for this, but I like to just look at it as sort of two fractions, right? So let's say that we collect 10 honeybees and we mark those, right? So we mark 10 honeybees, and then we come back, at a later time, and we go around and we collect 50 honeybees, right? And we notice that out of that 50, 5 actually have a mark. So 5 with a mark out of 50 collected. Well, now what we can do is we can set this up as a fraction sort of comparison like this. And then when we solve for x, this would equal, an estimated total population. Now, we haven't really had to do this on any AP test yet, so I still don't go into it that much here, but this would be the concept that you could use in this kind of scenario. But what's most important of all is that density is dynamic. It's always changing, right? And it's changing because of these four things here: birth and death and immigration and emigration. So let's delve into this a little more. So this formula might look a little bit familiar to you. I know it should if you took my class as a freshman, but essentially one of the ways that we can estimate population size or estimate population density or the change therein is this formula right here, which is the ways to get into a population minus the ways to get out of a population. So, N is your population size, T is time, and so this whole, D idea is a calculus thing, not to get too caught up in it all. But then we look at, okay, there's two ways to get into our population. There's birth and there's immigration. And then there's two ways to get out, right? There's death and emigration. So look, this poor guy doesn't know what's coming. So if we take the ways to get into the population and we subtract away the ways to get out of the population, that gives us sort of a population change. Now, if you notice this note right here, it tells us that immigration and emigration are typically pretty insignificant in terms of statistics. So usually all we have to say is that we can get a pretty good idea of population change by looking at birth minus death. The problem is, freshman year, we did this in a very kind of rudimentary way, right? We said, well, there were 10 giraffes born and 4 died, so we have a change of 6, right? But that's just looking at one moment in time. It's not very realistic. And so what we need to be able to do is dig a little bit deeper into this whole idea of density changes. Now, the first thing we have to recognize is that using a whole number of births and deaths is not a very good way to do this, right? What would be much more useful is looking at the average number of birth and death per individual over a given time frame. I know there's a lot of things going on there, but what this is referred to as per capita death rate and per capita birth rate and per capita death rate. So they're defined a little more simply right here, right? Per capita birth is the number of offspring produced per unit time by an average member of our population. Because also realize that not everyone is capable of reproducing, right? Whether you're too young or too old or whatever. So we need to look at this kind of as an average. And then per capita death is the same idea, right? The expected number of deaths, aka mortality, per unit time in a given population. Now, if we've got actual data on a population, we can actually calculate this, and we can use this data as a sample to consider a population of basically any size. All right, so step through with me here. So first, if we have a hypothetical population of meerkats, and we've established that there are 1,000 meerkats in the group. Well, if we study this population of meerkats for a year, and we find that there were 34 new babies, then we can say there were 34 births for 1,000 meerkats total in a year, gives us a rate of 0.034. And now we can apply this to any meerkat population, right, if we know the total number of meerkats in that population. And we use this formula, but don't get too caught up in this at all. You don't have to know this little formula. But basically, so if we find another population of meerkats, and there's 500 of them, well, then we just apply this per capita birth to them, right? We say 0.034 times 500 meerkats means we would expect 17 births in a year in that population. And then we can do the same thing over here with deaths, right? If we start with this population study of 1,000 meerkats and we find that 16 of them die, well, then we can say 16 out of 1,000 is 0.016 mortality, right? So we use a lowercase m. And then again, if we look at this other population of meerkats with 500 members, we can then say 0.016 times 500 is 8 deaths per year. So for this other hypothetical population, we would expect 17 births and 8 deaths per year. And that's what per capita means. Now, the best thing of all here, okay, you do not have to explain this to me later. All right, what we're doing here actually over the next couple slides is I'm sort of going to show you how we're going to derive a formula that you are going to have to understand. But you don't have to be able to derive this for me. I just think, and I could be totally wrong, But I just think it'll make a little more sense in the long run if we kind of explain how we got there. So, yeah, here we go. So I'm dragging on here. So here's what this means. Right, for any population, instead of just saying birth minus death, what we want to say is per capita birth minus per capita death, which means we take, this change in births and this change in deaths and apply it to the actual population that we're talking about, right? Where N is population size. Now, we can go even simpler because a lot of times somebody who is studying these sort of things, they don't really care what the actual birth per capita number and the actual death per capita number is. What we're interested in is the change in those things. So what we look at is R, the rate of increase or the rate of change, which is just birth minus death or birth minus mortality, as we see here. So we can continue kind of modifying our initial formula, right? Now we can say this change in our population over time is going to be equal to the rate, R, times the population size, N. Now again, you do not have to derive this to me, right? You don't have to be able to explain this. But this puts us at an interesting place that I hope does make sense here in this box at the bottom, right? If our rate of change, R, is positive, greater than 0, right, then the population is growing. And if our rate of change is negative, R less than 0, then the population is declining. And if R equals 0, if there is no change, we call this ZPG, zero population growth, where birth and death are balanced. And this is, as you might guess, really uncommon, for that to happen. But it is something that we could see. Now, let's keep going. So, if a species exists in an ideal, meaning not realistic, situation where resources are unlimited, there's plenty of space and mates and food and water and whatever, then we might see what is referred to as exponential population growth. And we typically do mention this in the freshman class. We just don't go into much depth at all about what it means. But exponential population growth, right, ever increasing. And the formula we use for exponential growth is R max times N. So you'll want to kind of recognize this. In fact, this is on the formula sheet now. We've gotten to that point here for the AP exam. And R max times N just means this is the maximum per capita rate of increase that we could see. So the maximum R, right, the biggest change. And when you apply that biggest change number to N, the population size, you get rapid increase. All right, and so when we graph this out, it's going to give us sort of a J-shaped curve like we see in this picture. Right, and it's hard to say what the population's R max would be, but it could range, right? If R max is 1, then you're going to get a really steep curve here. If R max is just half, you're not quite as steep, but you still just have this rapidly increasing population. Now, when you look at an exponential curve, what you also notice if you think about this mathematically, right, is that over time, this slope increases, right, as this line goes higher and higher. Now, the reason is not because the rate is any different. The reason is because that N number is getting bigger, right? So if our R max stays the same, but we keep using a bigger and bigger N, let's say, it has 100 members, and then 3 weeks later, the population, has 1,000 members. Now we're going to grow faster and faster as more and more organisms are there to be able to reproduce. Now, the kind of cool thing is, exponential growth is seen in nature, right? Even though this is based on an ideal environment, which, like we said, is not very realistic, we do see this. right? We see this when populations are bouncing back, right? Let's say populations go into a new environment where there are just tons of resources at their fingertips. Well, we'll see exponential growth. Or to go back to kind of our last chapter, um, if the bottleneck effect reduces numbers, well, now you have a lot of resources available to you because there are way fewer organisms. So what we will see in these scenarios is exponential, really rapid growth. But again, remember that this is ideal conditions. And as this population grows, resources are going to become more and more limited. So let's go back to our formula a little bit here. Right? In the real world, resources are limited, which means that exponential growth is limited. Right? And there is a limit to the number of individuals that we can occupy in a place, and that is called carrying capacity. It's a super important vocab term here. Carrying capacity, also abbreviated as K, is a really important term. Right? This is the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain. Now notice this is very important, right? We are not saying the maximum that can be reached. What we're saying is this is the maximum that we can keep going. So like a population might be able to get up to 1,000 individuals, but if there's only enough resources for 900 individuals, then we're going to see, coming back down a little bit and settling at the carrying capacity. Now, what we look at then is that, birth will be high until we reach or exceed carrying capacity, at which point mortality or death will increase because of these limiting factors, right? Food, water, shelter, safety, mates, etc. And all of this will affect this R value that we had in our formula a few minutes ago. So when we look at a realistic population, we see something that has what's called an S-shaped curve. It has an exponential time period, but then it levels off. Right? And this is called logistic population growth. Logistic population growth is more realistic. Right? This is where resources are actually limited, and we end up with a scenario where the population levels out at carrying capacity, right? K. So you'll have this exponential period of time, right? But then eventually things will start to level out, and so we call it logistic growth. Now, this takes us to a little bit more complex looking formula, which again, you don't have to explain how we got there, but you are going to have to sort of be able to use this formula, not even from a mathematical perspective, but from just sort of a logic perspective. All right, so remember that K equals carrying capacity, and N equals our population size. It's like our actual number of organisms. And then notice we've got in here this exponential growth formula that we used a few minutes ago, right? Where R max is like the maximum rate of change that we can see. But what we do is we add to that this logistic piece, right? Where we're asking, how far away are we from carrying capacity? So, this slide is incredibly important. We have seen something about this show up on the majority of AP exams. I can also pretty much guarantee you that something of this nature is going to show up on our Unit 7 test whenever we get to it. And this is something that we will definitely be reviewing in class together as well. But what we need to look at is explaining this formula and how it shows up in a real scenario. So first, I'm going to draw over here a graph that we want to kind of look at, which is just sort of a sample logistic growth graph. All right, so in the sample logistic growth graph, we've got time on the x-axis, we've got, we'll say population size on the y-axis. And so we would see, again, sort of this graph that would look something like this. All right, now the first thing I'm going to add in here is an illustration of carrying capacity. All right, so here's my carrying capacity. And remember that at any given moment, our population size is n. Okay, so let's start with sort of this first bullet point here. We're going to call this, oops, wrong thing. We're going to call this number 1. And number 1 takes place in this exponential part of our graph. Right, so if population size n is way less than carrying capacity, then that really has an effect on this fractional part of our formula. Right, let's say that carrying capacity is 1,000 and our current population is 2. Right, then we do 1,000 minus 2 over 1,000, and this is almost equal to 1. Right? And if it's almost equal to 1, that means that we're essentially just using our exponential growth formula. Right? And so what we expect during this time period is that you'll have a rapid increase in population size, or exponential growth. Now, then let's move on to our second bullet point here, 2. And we're going to say this is what's starting to take place in this kind of area on my graph. So as n approaches or gets closer to carrying capacity, this fraction, right, at the end of our formula is going to get smaller and smaller. Now what that's going to do when multiplied against our max is going to slow that rate. So as n approaches k, our growth is going to get slower and slower. And so we should start to see, growth, but we're going to slow down that slope, right, of that line. Now, eventually, we're going to get to a point, we'll call it 3 here, where n equals k. Well, if n equals k, then the top part of our fraction becomes 0. And that means the whole fraction becomes 0, and the whole formula becomes 0. So this is ZPG, zero population growth, where, at least for a moment in time, we would expect no increase or decrease. Now, we still have one more thing, though, that can happen, or does happen, and that is that we exceed carrying capacity. So shown here as number 4 on our graph, when n is greater than k, the fractional part of this formula becomes negative, and that means that we see a drop in our population size. And it's going to move back to carrying capacity. So again, we will continue to review this, but notice we don't expect it to use numbers with this formula. We just expect that the formula itself kind of makes sense to you. Now here's just a little bit more then about logistic growth curves. Um, Again, we call this an S-shaped curve. And what we expect is an exponential period of time here. That color's not any good. An exponential period of time. Then we start to slow our growth, and then we level out at carrying capacity. Now, one thing to point out, though, too, is that this usually is a graph where they show it nicely aligned at carrying capacity, but that's not realistic. Right, a real population, they're showing you this little Daphne microorganism here in this graph. But a real population might kind of have stops and starts. It might do this kind of stuff. It might go way over carrying capacity. Then we usually come back down below carrying capacity and we sort of do this number. But if we just sort of do a best fit line, we get something that looks a little bit S-shaped and looks logistic. But notice that, these microorganisms, they're not aware of their carrying capacity. So we're definitely going to have more of them than we can sustain, and then we probably drop below what we can actually sustain, and then we go back above again, and it just slowly probably gets closer and closer to what that actual carrying capacity is. So I know that was a lot to digest, but we also have a couple other things here to bring up. One is that evolution, we think, also applies to population density. There are behaviors or traits that are better for you depending on how dense your population is. So the first thing is called K selection. K selection is a lot like humans. A lot of other organisms also show this K selection. And this is where the traits that are favored or the traits that are more fit are going to help you if there's high population density. And kind of in our case, if you're in a stable environment where resources are available, but resources are limited, right? So in other words, this is when population density is close to carrying capacity. Just to point out real quick, humans, we probably aren't that close to our carrying capacity. But we got to realize that humans are a little bit different case because of our consciousness and our ability to sort of plan, but also that, our resources are actually limited. So check out the K-selected traits. Right, we have long lifespans. We begin breeding fairly late in our lives after many years, right? We have longer generation times. It takes a long time to make a new generation of humans. We have fewer offspring. Most people today having 2 or 3 kids maybe. We have long-term parenting where we take care of our kids for many, many years. And again, in part because of our consciousness, we make careful use of resources that we recognize are limited. Now, this is different than our selected traits. Now, our selected traits are things that are really just meant to maximize your reproductive success. And this is generally in the face of low density populations. So you've got plenty of resources. You don't have to be careful. Right? So don't have to carefully use resources in this scenario. And these are also going to be traits that are useful if your environment is rapidly changing. In other words, these are behaviors that will maximize maximize your rate of increase. So notice this is basically the opposite of what we do. Right? This is short lifespans. Begin breeding very early in the life cycle. So maybe within the first year of existence, these organisms are already breeding. Produce large numbers of offspring that you don't parent necessarily. So, you produce a big, think about sea turtles, right? Sea turtles lay a whole bunch of eggs. Those are born, but the parent is gone, right? Another interesting example of this is the axolotls that live in our biology lab. When they laid eggs last year, they laid upwards of probably about 150 eggs, and then they ignored them. Right, the parents don't do anything to raise those offspring, and what they're doing is just producing as many offspring as possible and letting them loose. And they can make tons of offspring because resources theoretically aren't limited, and this hopefully increases the odds that our offspring will actually get out there and survive. For us, we have a couple kids, we parent them, we take care of them, we ensure that they survive. It's just another kind of approach to go our selection and produce tons of offspring and just hope that a couple survive even if you don't take care of them. Now, getting away from density for just a minute, but I promise this video is almost finished. We've got dispersion. I don't even think you need me to explain much about this. I think it's pretty straightforward to just read through. But clumped is most common. We're going to see organisms where we see resources, right? Uniform can happen. Uniform is typically seen, it's not an exact pattern. It can be if we talk about like crops that humans plant, but typically you see uniform dispersion because of plants that inhibit secretions that keep another plant from growing too close to it, or territoriality. Penguins, the males, when they're taking care of eggs, will show uniform distribution or dispersion because they want to stay as a big group for protection from predators and warmth and things like that. But they also are very protective of the space right around them so that no other penguin messes with their egg. And then random is exactly what it sounds like. What scientists say is this is not quite as common as you'd expect, but certainly like wildflowers in a field are randomly dispersed by the wind. A lot of solitary animals, like a tiger, would also be randomly dispersed because they just kind of go do their own thing. Now, video break. Obviously, you're kind of on your own for this one, but if you've never seen Antoine Dodson before, make sure that you look that up and make sure that you get the original news version of Antoine Dodson, who is highly entertaining. But something else we can just mention briefly here, because we've covered this in previous classes, I hope, is biotic versus abiotic factors. Populations are affected by other living things, right, as well as non-living things. And so your biotic factors can include predators and prey. It can include competitive species. It can include individuals within your same species. It can include disease-causing organisms, but anything else that's alive in your environment is called a biotic factor. Anything not alive that still could have an effect on your population is called an abiotic factor. So things like sunlight, temperature, water, oxygen, salt content of water, can all be considered abiotic. Last thing then for density and dispersion is all about the limiting factors that are around. So we've been mentioning here in this video that populations are limited, leading to logistic growth. But what does the limiting? So limiting factors can fall into one of two groups, and this is kind of wordy, but they can be density dependent, meaning that birth and death are affected as the density of the population changes. So in other words, the number of individuals matters in this scenario. Or limiting factors can be density independent, which means that the number does not matter in the environment. So let's take a look at what this can mean. Honestly, I wouldn't worry about this graph much. The only thing I was kind of trying to show you here is the red line is density independent, meaning that it makes no difference what the birth and death rate are or what the population density is. You're going to just get the same consistent birth and death when it's a density independent situation. So let's look at why. Density-dependent limiting factors are things, again, where the number of individuals makes a difference. So, for instance, competition. Right? Competition will increase as density increases. Right? The more organisms there are, the more likely they are to compete with each other. Predation, same idea. Right? The more predators there are, or the more or less prey there are, the more that's going to change the size of your population. Toxic waste buildup. This is a weird one. This is typically for unicellular organisms, but like yeast, right? Yeast that we use to make bread rise or that we use to make alcoholic beverages, this creates ethanol. Well, at a certain point, yeast is actually killed by ethanol. So the more it makes this toxic waste, that can start to have an effect on the population. Territoriality, here's a weird picture of a cheetah marking its territory that came from your book. But this is true too, right? Territoriality really just kind of starts to play into overcrowding. But if organisms are really protective of their area and you start to get more and more organisms, this becomes a bigger and bigger factor. Disease is something very pertinent right now, but this is something that is density dependent. This depends on the number of pathogens, right? So the number of organisms that cause the disease, as well as the number of hosts, right? So this depends on the number of bacteria in your environment, and it depends on the number of you that are there. And then your book talks about intrinsic factors. Don't get too worried about that. That just means things that are internal to an organism, but might change because of the number of organisms around them. Then, last thing here, we've got density independent examples. Now, density independent examples, again, is where the number of organisms makes no difference. It means that these sort of things can affect your population size no matter what size that is. So these are things like natural disasters, right? If you think about it, a wildfire. A wildfire could kill a population of 50 deer. It could kill a population of 5,000 deer. And it doesn't matter which population is there. The wildfire will have the same effect on that population. And so these density-independent things are typically natural disaster type phenomena that can wipe out a population no matter what size it is. Okay, I know that was lengthy. But that gets us through at least density and dispersion in terms of population dynamics.